Join me as I sew this beautiful 18th century inspired bodice using a floral brocade fabric. I have to admit that I particularly enjoyed this project because I wanted to match the fabric's motif along the bodice seams, and the result turned out wonderful. To sew this bodice, I used our Roma bodice pattern. Originally, the pattern comes with written instructions, but here we're going to look at a slightly different method for sewing the bodice. As I mentioned, I wanted to perfectly match the motif across the different pieces of the bodice pattern, so I had to spend a little extra time cutting the fabric. If you also want to match a motif, a tip that might come in handy is to remove the seam allowance on the parts, on the pieces, where you want to match the motif. This will allow you to see much better how the motif falls on each piece. So, on the Roma bodice, I'm removing the seam allowance from the center back, the sides, and the front side seam. Although the Roma bodice normally has a center back seam, I wanted to cut it on fold for this model. I'm going to use this motif so that it sits on the center back, so I don't think it's necessary to add a seam. Of course, when you want to match a motif on a fabric with a motif as organic as this one, the ideal thing to do before you start cutting is to check all the pieces and see how the motif falls by placing all the pieces together to make sure you like the result. And you have to understand that, depending on the garment, you might have to sacrifice the motif in some places. This fabric frays quite a bit, so I'm going to leave the seam allowance of the bottom tabs uncut until it's time to sew them. I'm going to interface all the pieces to prevent the fabric from fraying and at the same time give the fabric a little more structure. When I want to match a motif, I take my time with the cutting process, going piece by piece to check how the motif lines up. In any case, this is a task that simply requires attention and time. Of course, if you like craftsmanship, this is a process you can really enjoy. And now, we're leaving the cutting stage behind and starting to sew. The process of sewing this bodice is very simple. I'm going to start by joining the front piece to the side panel, following the curved shape and stitching along the seam allowance. I'm basting the seam line just to get a better idea of where the seam will be on the right side of the fabric, because, as I said, I want to match the motif. This step isn't necessary if you don't have a specific goal, like the one I mentioned. Since this fabric is quite thick, I'm going to press the seam open. And I'll use the sewing ham to help shape the bust, although this bodice, being inspired by the 18th century, doesn't have a particularly voluptuous shape. You need to fold the front piece along the pattern marks. Now, we'll join the front to the back along the side seams. After sewing this, the outer bodice will be complete except for the boning, so we'll repeat the same process to sew the lining. On the center front piece of the lining, we can omit the part that folds inward. So we'll simply cut away that section of fabric along the pattern marks. We'll set the lining aside and move on to adding the boning to the shell. I'm going to place a pair of boning strips at the center back of the bodice. Since I don't have a seam, I'm going to use a tape to insert the boning. Any tape that isn't too thick will work for this. The pattern has markings on both the back and the side seam of the front for placing diagonal boning. Transfer these marks to the pattern and place another strip of tape so we can insert the boning later. Finally, we need to create the channels for the side and front side seams. Usually, I would press the entire seam allowance to one side and insert the boning inside because it's more durable that way. But since this fabric is thick, I'm going to press it open. I'll simply stitch along the seam allowance to create a channel. Stitch a line parallel to the seam so we can insert the boning. Since we folded the fabric inward on the center front piece, we'll do the same here. We'll stitch a few parallel lines so we can insert the boning. We'll make a first stitching for the first boning. Then leave a space where the eyelets will be, and make another pair of parallel stitches to create a second channel. And finally, patiently insert the boning into each channel. You can use Ridgelant type boning or plastic or metal boning. Remember that you need to sew a bias binding at both the top and bottom of the bodice, so the boning shouldn't reach the seam allowances. Otherwise, you'll run over it with the machine and risk breaking the needle. Now that I've reached the final stage of making the bodice, I'm going to shape it by trimming the excess fabric at the bottom tabs. We'll place the lining wrong sides together with the outer bodice. We'll have excess fabric at the center front. We'll shape it by folding the fabric inward, and we can trim the excess if we don't want so much fabric gathered there. The important thing is that once sewn, the lining sits on top of the brocade in this case. I'm doing it this way because, again, the brocade is a fairly thick fabric and it would be too bulky if I tried to layer it over the lining. You have to carefully pin the lining to the outer fabric so that both pieces act as a single layer of fabric. It's advisable to baste the entire outline instead of just leaving it pinned. I'm going to join the lining to the brocade at the center front using a blind stitch. though if you prefer, you could use a top stitch that would show on the right side of the fabric. This is almost done. We just need to contour the bodice with bias tape, but I won't lie to you. This is quite a labor-intensive task because of the tabs at the bottom. I'm going to cut a 3 cm wide bias tape from a lining fabric. A lightweight fabric that will allow me to handle all the curved areas more easily. We'll cut as many pieces as necessary. If you find it very difficult to handle the bias tape, you could baste it. Personally, I find it easier to handle it as I sew. It helps me shape it better. It's true that this outline has some very complicated parts because there are very tight curves, such as the ones on the straps. I'm sorry to say there's no secret technique for doing this. You just have to be very careful, and if the seam allowance is 0.5 centimeter, it's easier to do than if the allowance is larger. This process you just saw on the shoulder strap is the one you'll need to do on each of the lower sections. Once the first stitch is done, we'll simply cover the seam as you would with standard bias tape, shaping it. It really helps me with such complicated shapes to baste the entire outline. And in this case, I'll do the second stitch by hand. I think it's a good idea to start at the top of the neckline to warm up before moving on to the bottom of the bodice. Of course, if you're having a hard time sewing this part by machine, you can always do it by hand. Regardless of that, I'll leave an extra tutorial in the video description that can help you with sewing these kinds of shapes. So, the only thing left to finish this bodice is to spend a few hours completing this bias binding stage. And then you'll simply have to place the eyelets according to the pattern markings.